This narrow passage at the entrance to the Red Sea is less than 20 miles wide. It sits on the route that leads directly to the Suez Canal, which carries about 12% of global trade. Analysts estimate that the Bab-el-Mandeb itself accounts for a low to mid-single-digit share of world seaborne goods, small in percentage, but large enough that delays here ripple through supply chains worldwide. By 2025, those risks extend far beyond piracy. Drone swarms, anti-ship missiles, and hijacking attempts now dominate the threat list. The decisions shipping companies face here carry enormous costs. This video will explain why the danger persists and what is at stake for global trade. To understand that, we need to look more closely at this waterway itself, both its geography and its role as a chokepoint. The chokepoint at the Gate of Tears. At the southern entrance to the Red Sea, the waters narrow sharply before opening into the Gulf of Aden. This is the Bab-el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, named long ago to mark the peril ships have always faced here. Despite being less than 20 miles across at its tightest point, this strait is one of the world's most significant maritime chokepoints. It lies on the vital link that feeds into the Suez Canal, which handles about 12% of all global trade. Estimates vary, but industry groups often cite that around 7% of world seaborne goods pass through Bab-el-Mandeb itself. The alternatives are technically possible, but rarely chosen. Detouring around the Cape of Good Hope typically adds 7 to 14 days to a round trip between Asia and Europe, with additional fuel and operating expenses often running close to $1 million, according to shipping industry analyses. That dependency is why any attack here ripples outward from the Strait into global oil markets, consumer prices, and store shelves thousands of miles away. This reliance puts enormous pressure on companies moving goods across the route. Vessels clearing Singapore, Mumbai, or Shenzhen have little option but to schedule their passages through this narrow cut of water. Bulk carriers loaded with grain, oil tankers ferrying crude, and container ships stacked with electronics all depend on it. For some firms, even a temporary diversion around Africa can erase entire quarters of profit, while for others the delays jeopardize contracts and delivery schedules that underpin global supply chains. The deterrent value of the Cape exists, but the costs are so high that it is invoked only as a last resort. Instead of shifting away, most of the industry absorbs the risk and continues through the Bab-el-Mandeb, knowing its exposure grows with every transit. In normal circumstances, such a bottleneck might be manageable with coordinated naval patrols or greater security frameworks. But the geography here makes defense unusually difficult. The strait's narrowness forces ships into predictable lanes, reducing maneuvering space for vessels that can easily exceed 300 meters in length. On one shoreline stands Yemen, plagued by drawn-out conflict and militia-controlled zones. On the other lies Djibouti and Eritrea, regions often destabilized by shifting alliances and regional rivalries. A hostile faction with access to modern weaponry has theater-level influence simply by virtue of proximity. A single launch site placed along the coast can command a field of fire that stretches across much of the strait's width, leaving civilian captains with no easy countermeasure. For crews braving the passage, this transforms a routine leg of a voyage into a constant exercise in alertness. The threat is not confined to piracy, as in earlier decades when hijackers boarded ships seeking ransom. Today, the spectrum of potential attacks includes guided missiles, remote-piloted drones, and asymmetric boarding attempts. The attackers need only succeed once to cause losses running into hundreds of millions of dollars through sunk cargoes, stranded vessels, or spiking global freight rates. Meanwhile, individual ships cannot shield themselves effectively. They lack the radar coverage, firepower, or defensive systems built into military fleets. The result is a persistent imbalance. Vessels loaded with vital cargo sail, exposed through a corridor where non-state actors wield disproportionate influence. The resiliency of shipping companies is tested with each passing month. Insurers reevaluate premiums, sometimes hiking costs so steeply that smaller operators struggle to remain competitive. Crews sign on knowing the risks, but fatigue and anxiety rise under the possibility of sudden attack. Customs data, trade indices, and retail reports far away in Europe or Asia tell the story in economic language: fuel surcharges, inflationary spikes, delivery slowdowns. But for those aboard the ships, the reality is being locked inside steel hulls that could become targets at any moment. These human costs are difficult to price into freight indices, yet they shape decisions about staffing, routing, and investment. Dependence also fosters a cycle of exposure. Because global trade cannot pause whenever the region destabilizes, vessels continue sailing through, and by doing so, invite constant assessment by hostile groups. Even temporary suspensions of traffic are quickly reversed under the weight of economic pressure. When shippers avoid the Strait for weeks, shortages ripple through supply chains, shipping container shortages worsen, and consumer costs climb. Incentives push them back into danger sooner than they would prefer. In this way, the Bab-el-Mandeb becomes more than a geographic pinch point. It becomes a lever of influence held by actors far removed from boardrooms in Rotterdam or logistics centers in Dubai. It is this paradox that characterizes the Gate of Tears in 2025. The Strait remains indispensable, an artery without which the flow of oil, manufactured goods, and raw materials between continents cannot be sustained. Yet at the same time, it is defined by vulnerability, where insecurity onshore translates directly into risk at sea. This dual nature explains why maritime analysts consistently rank the Bab-el-Mandeb as one of the most dangerous shipping corridors in operation today. It is not just the congestion of vessels or the lack of room to maneuver that gives rise to danger. It is the convergence of global reliance with regional volatility, a combination that transforms every voyage into a calculated risk. To appreciate its importance fully, one must see Bab-el-Mandeb not as a mere slice of water on a navigational chart, but as a zone where the global economy meets the shifting front lines of regional conflict. Each cargo vessel transiting is more than tonnage and containers. It is a visible measure of how commerce continues despite danger. And every passage represents a gamble that political rivalries or militant ambitions will not ignite a new confrontation one ship too close. That tension is already shaping the kinds of threats ships face today. What once looked like a known set of dangers has begun to evolve. The risks no longer resemble the piracy outbreaks of the early 2000s, but have taken on new, more advanced forms involving modern weapons and tactics. The kinds of attacks now occurring in the Bab-el-Mandeb represent a clear departure from what companies prepared for only a few years ago, setting the stage for an even more unpredictable era of maritime insecurity. The new face of Houthi attacks. Only a short time ago, the dangers in the Bab-el-Mandeb were familiar, even predictable. Ships passing through faced harassment from small boats armed with rifles or the occasional attempt at boarding. Crews worried about being taken hostage or losing cargo through piracy-style raids. These encounters could be terrifying, but the threats were limited in range and capability. Naval patrols and heightened vigilance often provided enough deterrence. That world feels far away. By 2025, the Houthis' methods show a new stage of escalation, integrating technology, coordination, and weapons designed to match or exceed the defenses available to civilian shipping. A striking early marker in this shift came on 19 November 2023, when Houthi fighters boarded the commercial vessel Galaxy Leader using a helicopter in a dramatic mid-sea hijacking. That incident signaled a more daring phase of tactics, one where militants did not merely harass ships at the edges, but demonstrated the ability to directly seize them in a highly visible way. Soon after, attacks began to transform into multi-domain operations, with weapons far beyond small craft or small arms. One of the biggest changes has been the widespread use of drones. The Houthis deploy them in coordinated volleys, sometimes launched from coastal sites and other times from disguised boats at sea. A single drone might inflict little damage, striking only equipment or superstructure, but the power lies in their coordination. When multiple drones arrive at once, the strain on any defensive system multiplies. Coalition forces have intercepted large numbers, including an operation on 9 March 2024, when US and partner navies reported downing 15 drones in a single attack. But the attackers' persistence means companies cannot assume threats will lose momentum. For crews, hearing drone alerts has become routine, yet unlike storms or high seas, these warnings carry the knowledge of deliberate intent. The Houthis have added long-range anti-ship missiles to the mix, extending the danger far beyond the narrow choke point itself. Some of these weapons, reportedly guided with considerable accuracy, are fired from concealed launch sites along Yemen's rugged coast. Missiles now allow attacks well north into Red Sea lanes that once offered relative safety. The consequence is that an entire stretch of water dozens of miles long can now fall under threat, eliminating the possibility of timing a passage to limit exposure. Even heavily laden ships bound for the Canal may face targeting hours before they enter the Strait. This change makes the Red Sea more like a continuous hazard zone than a confined bottleneck. The surface itself is no longer free of surprises either. Unmanned surface vehicles, essentially explosive speedboats operating without crews, have taken their place among the arsenal. These vessels travel low in the water, avoiding early detection, and can be guided into hulls with devastating effect. Alongside these, the Houthis in mid-2024 claim to have developed a hypersonic missile nicknamed the Hatem II. Whether that claim reflects fully operational capacity or not, the announcement highlights the trajectory of their ambitions, widening the scope and sophistication of maritime strikes. Each new element complicates defensive planning, since ships must prepare against multiple domains: airborne drones, missiles from land, electronic interference, and potential attacks from the surface below. Electronic warfare has also emerged as a growing concern. Crews have reported disruptions to GPS signals and interference with communication systems. A container ship several city blocks in length depends on precise positioning data and constant updates to avoid hazards. Even a momentary disorientation can create huge risks in narrow waters. These incidents may not physically damage a vessel, but inject confusion into already stressful circumstances. Operators forced to question whether their navigation systems are reliable face heightened anxiety every moment of the passage. The disruption itself is part of the attack, diverting focus and amplifying the sense of vulnerability. Despite the escalation, it is important to note that defenses are not completely ineffective. Coalition warships and naval escorts have intercepted missiles, destroyed drones, and warded off numerous threats. Escorts have in many cases protected merchant convoys successfully, but the adaptability of Houthi forces, their mobility along Yemen's long coastline, and the mix of weapons employed mean that no defense can guarantee absolute safety. For shippers, the challenge is not only the scale of the threat, but the unpredictability of when and where it might emerge. Coordinated attacks illustrate this problem. In early 2024, for instance, commercial tankers faced layered assaults of drones overhead, combined with missile launches from the shore, forcing escorts to divide attention on multiple fronts. Even when interceptors neutralized some weapons, the simultaneity ensured that crews remained under pressure. The complexity of these engagements pushes beyond what naval escorts were initially prepared to counter, creating a scenario where every convoy must anticipate multiple forms of attack within the same window of time. Perhaps most troubling is the broadening of targets. In earlier periods of conflict, attacks generally aimed at ships linked to Western owners or nations seen as direct participants in regional disputes. By 2025, the pattern has shifted. Reports document strikes against vessels under Asian, African, and European flags alike, including those from countries with no obvious alignment in the Yemen conflict. The MV Reverberates, a bulk carrier, sank in March 2024 following a missile hit, the first loss of its kind in this confrontation, and only a few months later, in June, the MV Tutor went down after being struck. These sinkings underscored how any commercial fleet, regardless of nationality, could suffer devastating consequences. The idea that neutrality ensures safe passage no longer holds. For insurance markets and shipping planners, this universality creates deep uncertainty. Companies once calculated premiums and risk exposure by drawing distinctions between vessel registration, ownership, or cargo type. That model no longer applies. Any ship entering the Red Sea must be considered at elevated risk. This shift forces actors across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East alike into a shared problem: the costs of exposure and the pressure to decide whether transits are worth the risks. Life for crews has changed markedly in response. Instead of preparing for the possibility of pirates boarding for a ransom standoff, sailors now undergo drills to handle incoming drones or missiles. Life vests are worn during large portions of the transit. Alarms sound more frequently. Safety procedures stretch from basic security to complex rehearsals resembling military protocols. The mental strain is evident. The potential of an attack, even if intercepted, is enough to sap morale and create unease over the next voyage assignment. For many sailors, the psychological burden becomes as significant a factor as the cargo they are tasked to protect. The new face of the threat is one of persistent escalation and experimentation. Each attack refines tactics, whether synchronizing drone waves, combining missiles with electronic jamming, or inserting USVs to strike from the surface. Military coalitions adapt quickly, yet attackers adjust as well, maintaining pressure with relatively low-cost strategies. Each defensive victory highlights both capability and the fragility of operating in such an environment. To the shipping industry, the Red Sea has now become a contested theater where commercial commerce collides with asymmetric weaponry on a regular basis. The broader implications of this stretch well beyond military assessments. What unfolds at the Bab-el-Mandeb and through the Red Sea directly translates into logistical and financial consequences felt across continents. The danger on the water creates calculations in boardrooms, shipping consortiums, and insurance companies, decisions that ripple outward to suppliers, markets, and consumers. The mounting frequency of attacks shifts the core concern from whether ships can pass safely to how much it costs the world when they cannot. That impact is measured not only in losses at sea, but in rising expenses for everyone dependent on what those waters carry. Counting the costs in 2025. The scale of the financial consequences in 2025 becomes clear when comparing the cost of attack to the cost of defense. A single missile or drone launched from the Yemeni coast might cost only thousands, or at most hundreds of thousands of dollars to deploy. By contrast, diverting a single Asia-Europe round trip away from the Bab-el-Mandeb and around the Cape of Good Hope typically adds close to $1 million in additional fuel and operational expenses, according to multiple shipping analyses. For a fleet of dozens of ships, the expense climbs swiftly into the tens or hundreds of millions. This mismatch, where relatively cheap disruption forces worldwide industry to spend many times more in adaptation, illustrates how the Houthis impose outsized financial pressure without needing significant resources. The Cape route itself compounds the burden. Ships detouring around southern Africa travel thousands of extra miles, pushing crew shifts, maintenance requirements, and delivery schedules beyond their limits. Cargoes that were once just in time for factories, retail launches, or seasonal demand now arrive 1 or 2 weeks later. Electronics may miss holiday retail cycles, while car manufacturers face assembly lines idled by missing parts. Logistics networks depend on precision. Once disrupted, every delayed vessel cascades into scheduling conflicts that ripple through suppliers and distributors. Companies cannot simply absorb these interruptions without consequence. The costs travel through the system in ways as damaging as the delays themselves. By the end of 2023 and into 2024, container freight rates on Asia-Europe routes spiked sharply as major carriers rerouted or suspended operations through the Red Sea. Although rates moderated somewhat by 2025, they remain elevated compared to pre-crisis norms, as carriers pass higher fuel and insurance expenses onto customers. Tanker and bulk carriers report similar difficulties, with longer journeys raising both operational costs and exposure to volatile weather. Even where daily charter rates have softened in some markets, the embedded costs of rerouting persist, leaving no segment truly insulated from the disruption. One effect that has drawn attention from industry analysts is the impact on overall container fleet capacity. Longer voyages effectively reduce the number of round trips each vessel can complete in a year. UNCTAD and other research organizations have tracked periods where rerouting cut effective container shipping capacity by about 9%, despite the global fleet still having the same number of ships and containers. This constraint presses up against supply chains in subtle but significant ways. When available vessels drop out of circulation because they spend longer on water, the entire system tightens. Freight forwarders, importers, and exporters alike find themselves competing for space that is, on paper, still there, but in practice is tied up for longer. These tighter conditions spill into other markets. In the energy sector, each added day at sea for oil and gas shipments reduces predictability for buyers. Refineries that relied on uninterrupted Red Sea flows, particularly in Europe, face more frequent fluctuations in delivery schedules. Analysts at major banks projected that these uncertainties contributed measurable upward pressure on oil prices during 2024 and into 2025. For gas, the longer sailings to Europe complicated already fragile energy balances, particularly in winter months. Governments trying to stabilize household energy bills discovered that shipping costs had become an added variable, not just the commodity price itself. For food importers, vulnerability lies in timing as much as in cost. Grain shipments from East Africa or Asia lose competitiveness in destination markets when freight bills climb, or when cargoes arrive late enough to disrupt country-level procurement schedules. Analysts note that for developing nations, even relatively small increases in shipping expense can translate into sharp spikes in staple food prices. This is why policymakers in some regions intervene more aggressively, subsidizing imports or seeking alternative trade partners to cushion their populations. But intervention itself carries costs, often paid from already strained budgets. The impact of an avoided strait far from their waters lands directly at their ports and eventually on their streets. The financial pressure does not strike all shipping firms equally. Large multinational carriers can disperse costs across extensive fleets and long-term contract structures. Smaller players, however, struggle to absorb higher bunker bills and soaring insurance premiums at the same time. For many, the economics no longer work, leading to suspended services or exits from key trade lanes. The crisis has therefore redrawn the balance of global shipping, consolidating advantage with the largest players while leaving mid-sized and regional firms squeezed. Market share shifts under the weight of these rising expenses, reshaping competition in ways not entirely visible to outside observers, but keenly felt inside the industry. Beyond direct expenses, rerouting has destabilized contract practices. Freight contracts often lock in costs months ahead of time, but sudden operational changes render agreements unworkable. Shippers face renegotiations, penalty clauses, and disputes, while freight futures markets swing sharply in value on the uncertainty. Insurers, meanwhile, now routinely append war risk premiums to voyages through the Red Sea, costs that importers and exporters must pass on in turn. Larger importers have the scale to absorb such premiums. Smaller retailers have less leverage, leading to uneven effects across industries and countries. The financial burden of security, in this sense, mirrors the concentration dynamics in shipping itself. Attempts to manage these risks by routing certain cargoes differently also face practical barriers. Some have suggested that high-value freight should be rerouted entirely, while lower-value shipments might continue through the Red Sea. In practice, this distinction collapses under insurance classifications. All vessels entering Bab-el-Mandeb are treated as high-risk regardless of cargo value. That prevents shippers from gaming the system, forcing both high-margin electronics and bulk grains alike into the same risk category. Carriers therefore must decide on the strait as a whole, not per cargo type, leaving few alternatives to either pay the premiums or bear the longer voyages. Measured at aggregate scale, the totals are immense. If thousands of ships avoid the Red Sea over the course of a year, the accumulated expense runs into many billions of dollars. Economists calculate that on some measures, the diverted costs equate to entire national GDP levels. Though global trade has endured shocks before, the persistence of this one, tied not to an isolated accident but to ongoing conflict, creates a more lasting form of inflationary pressure. Reports from institutions such as JP Morgan noted that extended Red Sea disruptions added measurable upward pressure on global prices in 2024, and similar concerns continue into 2025. The forecasts underscore an uncomfortable reality. What happens around a 20-mile strait in Yemen can be observed months later in consumer indexes half a world away. The asymmetry of the contest remains one of its defining economic features. Militants expend the equivalent of a few automobiles worth of funds when they launch a missile, while the global system sacrifices enough resources to build dozens of new container ships in order to mitigate. This disproportion is what alarms shipping executives and policymakers most. It demonstrates how easily a lightly resourced force can dictate wide economic outcomes through persistent disruption. The imbalance erodes confidence in global trade stability and forces governments to consider costly naval deployments as a backstop, layering public spending on top of already strained private sector budgets. By 2025, the costs of the Bab-el-Mandeb crisis are being felt in boardrooms, supermarket shelves, and government fiscal ledgers alike. Each diversion and every premium marks another increment in the cumulative burden that ripples outward from this single corridor. Even so, behind the macroeconomic data is another set of costs, less easily measured. The weight of this crisis also falls on the individuals who sail these waters, tasked with moving goods through hazardous zones while coping with the human consequences that never appear in shipping accounts. It is in their daily reality that the consequences of this trade route insecurity take on their most personal and immediate form. Life on board, the seafarer's strain. Life on board a merchant vessel in these waters is shaped less by the economics of trade than by the strain carried by the people themselves. For crew members, the crisis is lived minute to minute. Missile strikes and drone interceptions may dominate headlines, but the true weight lies in the daily routines disturbed by the knowledge that each quiet hour could be broken by an alarm. Mariners are not debating supply chain resilience or profit margins. They are reckoning with the prospect of sudden violence while at sea. Ordinary tasks never feel ordinary under these conditions. Safety drills that are meant to be administrative exercises elsewhere become daily rehearsals with life-or-death implications. Crews are instructed where to move if a siren sounds, how to isolate compartments if fire follows a missile hit, and how to brace machinery for sudden power loss during electronic jamming. Life jackets, once reserved for emergencies, are sometimes worn while resting. Meals, navigation, or simple maintenance are all performed against a backdrop of hyper-alertness. When sleep comes, it is shallow at best. Woken by false alarms or sudden drone warnings, sailors never fully recover their rest. Over weeks at sea, the disruptions compound, limiting attentiveness and eroding morale. This imbalance takes a toll. Crew members know that their ships were not built for defense and that their training is for seamanship, not combat. Naval escorts and countermeasures add some security, yet the sense of vulnerability persists. Most sailors accept that the decision to transit here is made far above them, by companies balancing contracts with insurers or by governments calculating strategic needs. That lack of agency amplifies the tension. Safety feels less linked to the crew's skill than to decisions they cannot influence. The danger became all too real on March 6, 2024, when the bulk carrier True Confidence was struck by a Houthi missile in the Gulf of Aden. The attack destroyed sections of the vessel and killed 3 crew members, with emergency teams forced into a high-risk rescue of survivors. For seafarers across the industry, this was not just another report of damaged cargo. It was proof that crews could and do lose their lives in these waters. The attack has since circulated as a reference point on board other ships, a reminder that the risks are not hypothetical. Stories like these spread quickly among crews and shape how seafarers approach contracts. Reports from crewing agencies confirm many mariners now refuse Red Sea voyages altogether, creating staffing shortages that ripple through fleets. Operators offer war risk bonuses or higher wages as compensation, sometimes doubling pay for the duration of the assignment, but even financial incentives cannot erase the unease. Some sailors take the pay despite the fear. Others walk away, deciding that no bonus outweighs the stress of sleeping in a corridor where missile strikes are a daily threat. Recruitment pressures intensify as companies struggle to replace crews unwilling to board, and those who stay often cycle through these routes more frequently, risking burnout. On board, the psychological strain manifests in how crews interact. Mess hall conversations often drift toward new rumors of attacks, intercepted drones, and warnings overheard from nearby ships. Unofficial threat maps appear on notice boards, pieced together from scraps of intelligence and gossip. Captains and officers carry the added burden of convincing crews to trust in security measures they themselves know are imperfect. Leadership in this context extends well beyond navigation. It becomes about sustaining a minimum of confidence among people who feel perpetually exposed. The strain has also begun to reshape how sailors view their work. Contracting for a Red Sea transit no longer feels like signing up for transport duties. Crews compare their routines to deployed military units, complete with drills, alarms, and the constant prospect of hostile contact. Mariners who once worried about machinery breakdowns or rough seas now compare strategies for surviving missile fire. That shift alters not just decisions about individual assignments, but also how younger sailors think about life at sea as a career. For many, the risks at Bab-el-Mandeb are deterrents strong enough to reconsider the profession entirely. The longer this persists, the more visible the human consequences become in public industry data. Manning shortages drive up wage bills, while added bonuses for high-risk zones feed directly into operating costs. A company that once factored crew wages as a routine line item now calculates them as a variable dictated by conflict. In this way, the human costs of fear and refusal directly transform into an economic layer of the crisis, reinforcing its impact across the shipping system. Yet while economic models can measure these effects, they often miss the fatigue borne by individuals. Crews describe the hardest part not as a single attack, but the long anticipation of one. It is the steady erosion of sleep, the constant readiness drills, and the silence after a false alarm when the adrenaline still courses but there is no release. Unlike casualties or damaged vessels, this form of exhaustion leaves few visible traces, but its consequences build steadily, influencing both the readiness of current crews and the willingness of future crews to take the risk. For seafarers, the Red Sea passage has become a test of endurance as much as seamanship. Each voyage demands not only technical skill, but also the ability to sustain mental resilience under conditions of near-perpetual alert. This experience sets the stage for another dimension of the conflict, the external measures designed to protect them. Naval escorts, patrols, and coalition operations attempt to provide cover for merchant fleets, but for those on board, the difference these measures make is shaped less by strategy than by whether they blunt the fear at sea. The question is how far constant naval presence can go in reducing risks that remain unpredictable and persistent. The shortcomings of naval protection. In the waters around the Bab-el-Mandeb, naval escorts are now a permanent feature. A US-led initiative, Operation Prosperity Guardian, patrols the Strait alongside the European Union's Operation Aspides, with additional deployments from Asian and regional navies. On radar screens and through intercepted transmissions, the effectiveness of these combined forces is visible. They have shot down many incoming drones and missiles, averting strikes that would have otherwise destroyed merchant vessels. To industry observers, this multinational armada presents an image of strength, offering reassurance that vital routes are not abandoned. Yet the number of attacks keeps climbing. The problem is not that the escorts are absent or incapable. The problem is that their protection is fundamentally reactive. This reactive posture stems from the tactics of the Houthis. Launch sites are dispersed along Yemen's long, fractured coastline, with mobile platforms concealed in rugged hillsides or dense civilian areas. These launches can be moved rapidly, set up for a strike within hours and dismantled just as quickly. For naval forces positioned at sea, this makes preemptive neutralization nearly impossible. Warships must wait for launches to occur before they can respond, racing against the short arc of a missile or the sudden appearance of drone swarms. The geography amplifies this difficulty. The distances between Yemeni shorelines and shipping lanes are so narrow that even the most advanced detection systems leave escorts with only minutes to intercept. In this constant cycle, the initiative always belongs to the attackers. The use of drones exposes these limitations more than anything else. Drones can be constructed cheaply, transporting easily, and launched in volleys designed to exhaust defenses. A naval destroyer may detect them all, but cannot guarantee shooting each one down before a strike lands. The imbalance in cost is central to the attacker's advantage. Drones are produced and deployed at a fraction of the expense required for the intercepting missiles or defensive systems used against them. As a result, a cheap wave of expendable drones can impose millions of dollars of costs on coalitions tasked with defending shipping lanes. It is not that the escorts fail to act, they intercept large numbers, but that defeating each wave does not stop the next one from forming. Missiles layer another challenge onto this fight. A single successful strike can sink a vessel, as seen with the MV Rubberma in March 2024 and the MV Tutor in June 2024. Modern warships possess sophisticated radar and missile defense systems, but in Bab-el-Mandeb, the reaction window is measured in minutes or less. When a missile emerges from cover inland, its trajectory gives little time for counterstrike. In these conditions, every successful interception is impressive, but also precarious. The crews of merchant ships sailing in convoy alongside Navy vessels know that defense is possible, but not absolute. A slip, a distraction, or an overload of simultaneous launches could mean disaster despite the strongest escort presence. Technology provides tools to reduce this danger, but not to erase it. Electronic warfare systems can jam signals or interfere with drone controls, but attackers adapt quickly, switching frequencies, diversifying approaches, and employing mixed attacks to stretch defenses thin. Each measure creates a countermeasure, leaving nurseries of innovation on both sides. What escorts achieve is mitigation, preventing many disasters but never guaranteeing immunity. The very adaptability of attackers ensures that shipping cannot be insulated by hardware alone. Merchant sailors themselves embody this paradox. Seeing a frigate or destroyer alongside their vessel instills some momentary calm, a visible promise that they are not abandoned. But crews also understand the escort's limitations. They cannot accompany every ship simultaneously, and convoy systems require delays that seafarers already find stressful. Some vessels depart without naval cover, forced by schedules and cargo requirements. Even within a convoy, sailors recognize that escorts may prioritize defense for certain ships, leaving others exposed. For those who live the passage day to day, naval presence offers reassurance mixed with profound uncertainty. This reality is recognized in insurance classifications as well. Major insurers continue to designate the Bab-el-Mandeb and Red Sea as high-risk waters despite multinational deployments. If naval protection represented true deterrence, premiums might fall. Instead, high war-risk surcharges remain in place, a sign that underwriters, guided by data rather than symbolism, judge the region to remain hazardous. For insurers, the persistence of successful hits or near misses proves that defense is reducing losses without changing the underlying equation. In their calculations, naval protection equates not to safety, but to partial mitigation. The structure of multinational forces adds another layer of complexity. While cooperation is extensive, navies do not operate under identical rules. Commons Library reports have described how different participating states maintain distinct rules of engagement and national mandates. Some navies authorize preemptive measures, others act only after an incident has begun. This variation hampers the ability to present a single, coherent deterrent. Attackers, able to choose timing and method freely, exploit these seams. Furthermore, naval rotations ensure that presence levels fluctuate. A single coalition vessel leaving station for resupply can create temporary gaps, which need only hours for attackers to exploit. Strategically, the escorts serve as a buffer rather than a cure. They absorb some of the attack pressure, preventing catastrophic losses on a larger scale, but they cannot seal the threat entirely. The Houthis' geography, mobility, and low-cost arsenal ensure that even a vastly larger naval presence could not eliminate the danger at its source. The escort missions buy time and reduce casualties. They cannot remove systemic risk. And this recognition shapes the calculus for shipping firms and insurers alike. They know naval power provides resilience, but not certainty. Thus, naval protection in 2025 is best understood as an essential but partial response. It reassures without guaranteeing, intercepts without deterring, and symbolizes commitment while still leaving vulnerabilities exposed. Crews depend on it, insurers price around it, and governments pour resources into maintaining it, but its limits are visible in every continuing strike. The Bab-el-Mandeb remains highly dangerous not because navies are absent, but because their tools cannot erase the structural advantage of mobile, inexpensive, and dispersed weapons. The escorts soften the risk rather than resolve it, a distinction crucial for how the global shipping system adapts. And as the burden of risk persists on the water, another cost emerges ashore. Every voyage requires more than fuel and manpower. It demands an additional safeguard in the form of financial protection. This economic layer, carried by every merchant ship crossing the Strait, shows how the cost of insecurity stretches far beyond naval escorts alone. Insurance and the price of risk. Every vessel approaching the Red Sea must now account for more than cargo, fuel, or labor. The decisive factor is insurance, the specialized coverage that determines whether a ship can afford to risk the passage at all. Without war risk policies, few owners would consent to transit seas where drones and anti-ship missiles have already claimed tankers and container vessels. In 2025, these costs have climbed to levels that restructure how fleets operate. Industry reporting, including a Reuters analysis in July 2025, documented war risk premiums for Red Sea passages rising to roughly 0.7% of a ship's insured value, up from about 0.3% earlier in the crisis. What once represented a routine surcharge has become a core driver of operational strategy, and for some carriers, the single factor determining whether a route is viable. Mechanics of this shift lie in underwriting. Every attack catalogued near the Bab-el-Mandeb resets insurers' calculations, reshaping the price of passage. Successful strikes, drone swarms, or missile interceptions feed into actuarial models, and each incident nudges premiums upward. These decisions are not speculative. They are built on incident frequency, confirmed damages, and assessments of naval escorts' ability to contain threats. The cumulative effect is cumulative risk pricing. Instead of adding a fraction to base coverage, premiums now often outstrip the cost of basic hull and machinery insurance. For a company running dozens of voyages, the impact is measured not in marginal adjustments, but in tens of millions of dollars across an annual operating budget. Underwriters themselves have varied responses. Some paused coverage entirely for voyages deemed especially exposed, particularly following successful ship sinkings in 2024 that underscored vulnerability. Others simply impose steep rate hikes, but carve out categories of ships they will not cover under ordinary terms. Vessels with perceived links to Israel, whether through ownership, charterer, or cargo, are generally treated as higher risk, and in some cases avoided altogether, leaving operators scrambling for alternatives. The result is not a uniform premium, but a patchwork of conditions, exclusions, and negotiations that fragment the market. Access to cover has become as important as the rate itself, shaping who can sail and under what terms. Larger carriers navigate this landscape differently than smaller operators. Multinational firms with deep capital reserves are able to maintain continuous cover, secure bulk rate agreements, and distribute increases across global networks of clients. Their sheer size allows them to absorb premiums or pass them into freight charges without immediate collapse. For mid-sized carriers or independent owners, however, the same conditions create existential strain. A single vessel earning thin margins cannot withstand multiples of increased insurance cost. The risk-to-reward ratio simply collapses. Analysts from organizations including Maplecroft and the Washington Institute note that this dynamic accelerates consolidation. Put simply, scaling grants survival, lack of scale magnifies exposure. The divergence is stark. Large firms retain coverage, weather higher premiums, and fold costs into broader freight structures. Smaller players withdraw entirely, unable to finance war risk fees or convince underwriters to renew policies. Some suspend sailings for months at a time, hoping conditions ease, only to see competitors expand market share in the interim. Others exit contested routes permanently. This reallocation of risk-bearing capacity favors the already dominant carriers, further concentrating influence within a few major companies. If premiums persist at current levels, this acceleration of consolidation will likely grow sharper, reshaping how trade is distributed across the industry. These developments ripple into multiple layers of the system. For carriers who can still operate, the expense of coverage often comes at the expense of other expenditures. Budgets for maintenance tighten, crew compensation schemes shift toward temporary risk bonuses rather than long-term wage stability, and investment reserves are depleted. On the labor side, seafarers employed by firms forced from the Red Sea routes find themselves without contracts, seeking work with larger companies whose conditions and expectations differ. Insurance costs translate directly into the structure of maritime employment. Coverage or lack thereof decides who keeps sailing and under what terms. National economies are similarly affected. Countries with mid-tier shipping firms find those companies disproportionately vulnerable. Unable to afford rising premiums, they yield operational space to foreign giants whose scale allows them to remain. With market share shifting, national carriers decline in significance, nudging governments into deeper reliance on foreign firms to manage trade flows. That reliance brings with it a loss of bargaining leverage and strategic autonomy. In effect, insurers, through actuarial judgments and premium tables, influence how sovereignty over trade lanes is exercised. Each yes or no from an underwriter reverberates through national freight policies and balance of payments considerations. Insurers respond not only to damage, but to the asymmetry of risk. A single missile sinking a merchant vessel represents a payout worth tens of millions, even though the weapon that caused it cost a fraction of that amount. Each time such an event occurs, underwriters spread the financial repercussion across thousands of policies. While large carriers disperse the burden over many customers, smaller operators collapse under the accumulation. This cycle ensures that, statistically, the market protects the largest players and trims away the more fragile ones. For those able to adapt, premiums no longer feel unusual. Executives describe them as part of a new baseline of costs, a structural element akin to bunker charges or vessel depreciation. Once absorbed into rate calculations, these fees are unlikely to recede quickly. Past crises offer precedent. Piracy surcharges around Somalia lingered long after patrols sharply reduced incidents. Should the Red Sea crisis stabilize, insurers may not fully cut premiums back. Instead, war risk categories remain embedded in contracts, continuing to shape freight economics long beyond the fighting itself. Historical stickiness in such costs suggests that the industry should expect durable structural change, not just a temporary spike. This persistence dovetails with broader consolidation trends. Smaller carriers who hope premiums will soon collapse may simply not survive long enough to see such relief. Larger firms, meanwhile, continue to plan around elevated fees, raising questions about competitive fairness. If these conditions hold, rental markets, freight prices, and consumer costs shift toward a trajectory managed by fewer influential actors. Although the permanence of these patterns cannot be taken as certain, they now constitute the basis on which most forward planning occurs. Thus, insurance is not ancillary to the Bab-el-Mandeb crisis. It is the financial axis on which strategies turn. It determines access, shapes competition, influences labor, and defines national exposure. Every drone sighting and missile strike may last only minutes on the sea, but within the halls of insurers, those minutes are converted into years of structured premiums. The real costs of insecurity are stored not only in wreckage, but in contracts written in distant capitals, figures that define who moves goods across oceans. And while those contracts decide the fate of fleets at sea, they also travel further downstream. The burden does not end at underwriters' desks or shipowners' ledgers, it continues into the flow of goods themselves. Insurance premiums affect the price and timing of shipments, feeding into the decisions of global brands, wholesalers, and retailers who depend on steady supply. That shift in cost and uncertainty is now altering how companies outside of shipping, those who rely on timely deliveries for their business, reconsider their own strategies. Retailers and the supply chain shuffle. Retailers are directly in the crosshairs of the Red Sea crisis, where every delay or detour translates into missed sales and reshaped supply strategies. What begins as a disruption to shipping lanes ends up changing procurement decisions, warehousing patterns, and even how product launches are scheduled. For global brands, the real cost is not only in freight and insurance, but in the fragile timing of seasonal demand and competitive market cycles. First response has been pragmatic. Companies turn selectively to air freight when reliability cannot be trusted at sea. Freightos and other logistics analysts note a rise in this shift, though it is narrowly focused on high-value, time-sensitive goods like smartphones, tablets, or fashion items tied to seasonal releases. Crews of cargo planes now carry loads that once reliably moved through the Suez route, with retailers paying steep premiums simply to guarantee products reach shelves on time. The expense is considerable, but in industries where timing decides market share, it is judged better than absorbing the damage of a missed season. Warehousing strategies are shifting as well. Instead of operating lean and relying on just-in-time inventory, major retailers now build buffer stocks to protect against sudden shipping delays. Firms with the capital to do so rent or expand storage facilities close to consumer markets. Electronics companies stock reserve units before holidays, and fashion groups prepare seasonal products months in advance. Logistics analysts at Macmillan point out that this ties up significant capital, but for firms large enough to afford it, the trade-off avoids catastrophic losses from late arrivals. Warehouses, once simple transits along a supply chain, are now treated as insurance policies against maritime instability. Manufacturing diversification offers another layer of adaptation. Sigma 7 and other research groups confirm that brands are experimenting with moving some production to facilities closer to end markets, reducing exposure to chokepoints like Bab-el-Mandeb. North African suppliers are increasingly attractive to European clothing retailers, while electronics firms examine partial relocation to Latin America for the US market. This trend toward nearshoring does not eliminate disruption, but it reduces dependence on a single shipping corridor vulnerable to conflict. For firms with both flexibility and financing, these investments add another option when safe passage cannot be relied upon. The consequences are uneven. Small and mid-sized retailers lack the resources to pivot between air and sea, build warehouses, or reconfigure supply chains. They cannot afford premium air freight for consumer electronics or absorb multi-million-dollar upfront costs for new buffer stocks. Rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope may be technically possible, but at costs that destroy already thin margins. The gap becomes visible on store shelves. While the largest retailers keep products flowing, albeit at higher prices, smaller outlets are left empty-handed or forced to raise prices to levels their customers cannot accept. In effect, the Red Sea crisis amplifies inequality across the retail sector, concentrating resilience in the hands of the biggest players. These stresses often appear in subtle ways to consumers: a popular clothing size missing, electronics accessories delayed, or seasonal fashion arriving weeks late. For smaller brands, these delays can erase entire sales cycles. A winter line delivered in spring may be sold only through discounts, with revenue wiped away. In consumer electronics, lateness can surrender market leadership if a competing product arrives first. Every delay is magnified when seen through the lens of consumer expectations set to precise launch dates. One example of this disruption was visible in the automotive industry. In 2024, several plants in Europe publicly paused production after spare parts shipments through the Red Sea failed to arrive on time. Assembly lines froze not because of a lack of demand, but because critical components were stranded at sea or rerouted around Africa, pushing the arrival date weeks beyond their scheduled use. Such stoppages demonstrated how even industries operating far from the Strait can grind to a halt when maritime lifelines falter. The inflationary burden of these disruptions is not theoretical. Analysts at JP Morgan projected that, under certain scenarios, extended rerouting in the Red Sea could add roughly 0.7 percentage points to core goods inflation. Economists caution that the full impact varies by duration and severity, but the estimate illustrates the scale. What begins as higher freight and insurance bills becomes visible in household budgets worldwide. Shoppers encounter it directly in the form of higher clothing prices or surcharges on electronics. Inflationary pressure spreads from logistics into the everyday retail environment. Retailers adapt not only through logistics and inventory, but also through product decisions themselves. Fashion houses lengthen product cycles, investing less in rapidly rotating fast fashion collections and more in perennial basics that can sell across seasons. Electronics firms spread out launch schedules, aiming to stagger releases rather than risk all revenue on shipments tied to a single crossing. These strategic shifts reshape what consumers see in stores and how often they see it, a reflection of commercial survival rather than style or innovation alone. Meanwhile, commercial hierarchies inside companies are being reordered. Supply chain executives, once working in the background, now play pivotal roles in corporate decision-making. They report on geopolitical risks, negotiate multimodal contracts, and manage contingency strategies with direct consequences for retail performance. A delayed delivery no longer counts as a logistics issue alone. It is a board-level problem with retail and financial consequences. Corporate strategies increasingly revolve around logistics competence as a competitive differentiator. For smaller retailers unable to match these adaptations, survival rests precariously on volatile conditions. Some rely on third-party logistics providers, hoping pooled contracts secure them access to air freight or warehouse space. Others trim product ranges to reduce exposure. But without scale, their agility is limited, and delays in shipping corridors translate directly into losses. The gap between global titans and smaller rivals, already significant, is widened further by disruptions still unfolding far from the retail floor. For consumers, the connection is invisible but unavoidable. A family pays more for school electronics shipped by air, not knowing why prices jump compared to a year earlier. A customer looking for a winter coat discovers shallow inventory, never connecting it to missiles fired in Yemen. These purchases are the front line where global maritime insecurity collides with household budgets. Every transaction contains hidden costs tied to a strait thousands of miles away. The cumulative effect is a retail and supply chain landscape more fragmented, uneven, and risk-sensitive. Large multinationals refine supply strategies into systems resilient against maritime instability, baking higher costs into long-term operations. Smaller players tread water, hoping disruption recedes before financial strain consumes them. Across the sector, responses to the crisis underscore a new reality. Resilience has replaced efficiency as the ultimate measure of success. And yet, resilience alone is not guaranteed to be enough. As the complexity of attacks increases, firms are beginning to look for solutions outside of traditional logistics altogether. The search for security is no longer limited to rerouting or stockpiling, but extends to new tools capable of actively confronting threats at sea. Technology on the horizon. Technology is being introduced into shipping not just to improve efficiency, but increasingly as a means of survival. In earlier years, merchant fleets relied on passive defenses such as razor wire, reinforced doors, or water cannons to ward off pirates. But in 2025, none of those measures are useful against a guided missile or a wave of drones. That reality has pushed parts of the industry to investigate solutions more akin to military tools than commercial safety equipment. The outcome is a series of experimental vessels, sensors, and automated defenses now being tested, designed not to move containers, but to protect the ships that carry them. One of the most visible experiments is the autonomous escort vessel. These small, crewless ships are fitted with advanced radar and electronic systems capable of monitoring airspace for approaching drones or low-flying missiles. They are built to act as robotic guardians, trailing or circling around convoys. Unlike manned warships, they do not require large crews and can operate in high-threat zones without putting human lives directly at risk. Their endurance means they can remain on station for long stretches, and their onboard systems are designed to spot incoming threats faster than human operators. Artificial intelligence plays a central role in how they function. Rather than depending on a small team of officers to interpret complex radar images, these escorts use algorithms to help sift genuine threats from background noise. A key challenge in the Red Sea is distinguishing between harmless aerial activity, like fishing boats launching small drones, and hostile swarms aimed at disabling a ship. AI-driven systems attempt to flag patterns that suggest coordinated attack and to provide earlier warnings than human crews could. The speed of recognition matters. When a drone is detected just kilometers away, a delay of seconds can decide whether it is intercepted or strikes home. Some prototypes even feature active defenses. Directed energy systems and counter-drone launchers have been linked to these platforms, intended as close-in protection between an attacker and the main ship. The principle is straightforward. If an autonomous escort takes the brunt of the attack or intercepts drones before they reach a container carrier, the convoy as a whole is more likely to survive. The concept distributes risk, moving part of the burden of defense away from naval warships and into private hands operating directly within the commercial fleet. But optimism is tempered by practical barriers. Industry and policy research, including studies from the Washington Institute and Me Forum, emphasize that while autonomous escorts are being trialed, they are expensive and remain legally unsettled. Each platform can run into tens of millions of dollars once sensors, hardening, and weapon systems are integrated. Few carriers can justify scaling such technology across their fleets. Just as importantly, international maritime law was never built to handle privately operated armed drones or automated escorts patrolling global commons. Liability questions remain unresolved. If an escort misidentifies a target, or if its defensive systems harm neutral shipping, who is accountable? Without clarity, widespread adoption is unlikely. To date, few commercial operators have rolled out fully armed autonomous escorts at scale. Early trials have usually been conducted under naval supervision, with navies still carrying the primary defensive responsibility. In practice, these exercises are limited and experimental, focusing on data collection rather than turning private ships into combat-ready formations. Reports from 2025 show escorts shadowing convoys while destroyers and frigates remain nearby. These conditions demonstrate that the technology is being tested, but also underline that it has not replaced conventional naval protection. In real-world conditions, escorts face tactical challenges too. Their sensors can extend awareness, but range, weather, and jamming interfere with their active defenses. Swarm tactics quickly expose the limits of counter-drone weapons, overwhelming even advanced systems, and escorts themselves are vulnerable targets. A missile fired at them still forces a convoy to absorb sudden operational losses. Replacing one escort is costly enough that attackers may deliberately target them first. Critics argue this makes escorts less a guarantee of protection than an additional high-value target. Other technological responses are being tested in parallel. Some carriers install hardened radar suites and predictive onboard software to improve detection ranges, while others experiment with laser-based sensors to increase awareness of low-flying threats. Communications infrastructure is shifting towards satellite constellations resistant to jamming and interference. Software-driven logistics systems now play a defensive role too. Voyage plans are updated in real time, allowing ships to divert mid-route toward areas with stronger naval presence or safer waters. None of these measures transform a freighter into a fortress, but they do create incremental improvements in survivability and responsiveness. Uncertainty, however, runs through every innovation. A single high-profile failure could halt progress for years, scaring off investment and leaving fragile confidence worse than before. Executives hesitate to stake entire fleets on technologies that remain untested in sustained combat conditions. Shipping companies are cautious bureaucracies by design, framed around contracts and insurance, not battle experiments. Any tool must prove itself repeatedly before it becomes a standard part of the operating environment. Governments also weigh heavily on these trials. States with critical dependence on global shipping are uncertain whether to lean into private sector fixes or continue investing in expanding naval patrols. Some policymakers view private escorts as a possible relief to overstretched military resources, while others see them as a complicating factor in rules of engagement. If a privately operated system engages a target, questions arise over whether responsibility lies with companies or governments. In this way, each trial is as much a test of regulatory frameworks as it is of engineering. For all the investment and promise, three constraints dominate the debate. First is cost. Platforms are prohibitively expensive at a time when shipping margins are already under pressure. Second is regulation. No clear legal framework exists for armed, automated vessels in shared waters. Third is vulnerability. Escorts themselves can be attacked, sometimes at lower cost to the aggressor than to the operator. These realities narrow the enthusiasm, making technology appear as a supplement to naval power rather than a replacement. Technology may therefore reduce exposure in some cases, but it is not yet a proven or scalable alternative to multinational security efforts or political solutions ashore. Maritime defense still depends on navies, international cooperation, and the stability of coastal states. Machines help, but they cannot alter the fundamentals of geography or conflict dynamics in the region. For now, technology remains a tool of limited relief, unable to substitute for broader security arrangements. While trials continue and cautious optimism persists in some circles, the broader pattern is clear. Innovations offer marginal advantages, but they cannot yet guarantee safe passage. They may protect select voyages, limit individual losses, or reassure insurers slightly, but the structural vulnerabilities remain. What ultimately shapes global flows is not just the success of these prototypes, but the routings and decisions made by shipping companies in response to continued threats. And those decisions, whether to transit the Red Sea under protection or bypass it entirely, ripple outward into the economies connected to these shipping routes. The consequences are no longer limited to the policies of shipping firms or the safety of sailors, but are beginning to register in regional economies built on the traffic through these waters. Regional casualties of rerouting. Each diversion around Africa does not just lengthen voyages, it reshapes the economies that have long depended on the steady rhythm of Red Sea shipping. The most prominent casualty is the Suez Canal itself. Vessel traffic into the canal has fallen sharply, eroding the revenue that is one of Egypt's most important sources of hard currency. Data compiled in 2024 recorded a steep decline. Ship transits dropped from around 2,068 passages in November 2023 to roughly 877 by October 2024. For every rerouted convoy, millions of dollars vanish from Egypt's daily tallies, undermining a budget already stretched thin. The canal once provided reliable funds for public projects and infrastructure spending. With transits down, construction slows and new investments stall, leaving Egypt to borrow more heavily while ambitions for canal expansion are temporarily shelved. The impact flows outward from the canal to the wider coastline of the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. Ports that previously thrived on feeder services or ship support sea volumes shift, particularly those built to handle transshipment. Saudi Arabia offers an instructive example. OceanMine's 2024 monitoring noted that combined activity across major Red Sea ports like Jeddah and King Abdullah fell by roughly 45%, with throughput at King Abdullah alone collapsing more than 80%. Such figures tell the story of a regional system suddenly constricted. Once busy terminals lose docking revenues, container handling volumes fall, and the entire service ecosystem around them contracts. For port authorities and local businesses, these declines present not just temporary setbacks, but potentially enduring loss of status as key players in maritime trade. East Africa's experience is more uneven. Some ports such as Djibouti, which had grown into important hubs for both transshipment and international military presence, now see reduced cargo flow and growing idleness in support sectors like trucking and warehousing. Companies built around moving goods inland to Ethiopia or South Sudan confront fewer shipments, cutting work hours and laying off staff. But further south, the Cape route gives Durban and Cape Town an unexpected boost. Ships rerouting around the southern tip of Africa increasingly call at South African ports for fuel, provisions, or repairs. Their revenue rises even as their northern counterparts struggle. This split picture reflects the redistribution of maritime economics. Bypassing the Red Sea closes doors for some while opening them for others. But overall, the net losses across the region's ports outweigh the isolated gains. In states that built national strategies on transshipment, the financial strain translates quickly into social effects. Djibouti, for instance, has long presented itself as a key hub where international actors, from global logistics firms to foreign military forces, found value in location and activity. When container volumes shrink, trucking fleets fall quiet, hotels reliant on transient crews see fewer guests, and customs authorities face fiscal gaps. Governments operating on narrow margins confront tough decisions, cut spending in already strained budgets, or increase borrowing at higher interest rates. For workers, the change is immediate. Dock workers, port engineers, and service staff find hours reduced or jobs eliminated. Families who migrated to coastal cities for reliable work discover their livelihoods eroded in a matter of months. For Egypt, the Canal revenue plunge reverberates through national planning. Successive governments have tied prestige and long-term development to the Suez Canal's reliability as a currency earner. Income from tolls finances not only upkeep of the canal, but also national infrastructure, from urban construction to rural electrification. With ship counts falling to levels unseen in years, projects pause midway. Where investment was supposed to track upward, expansions, modernization, and auxiliary economic zones, the money instead drains away to plug day-to-day fiscal gaps. The contrast is sharp. Leaders who once promoted the canal as Egypt's growth engine find themselves defending why projected revenues have evaporated in real time. The contraction reaches deeply into labor markets along the Red Sea. Unemployed dockworkers in Jeddah and King Abdullah ports symbolize an abrupt reversal from growth to decline. In Kenya and Sudan, where smaller volumes once added jobs around port logistics, feeder shipping losses curtail opportunities. Many local economies are not diversified enough to absorb idle labor quickly. As a result, wages stall, shops lose customers, and the local tax base shrinks. Widespread unemployment in these sectors rarely makes international headlines, but for communities built around port activity, the downturn is immediate and personal. Even support industries away from the docks suffer. Trucking companies geared toward carrying containers inland scale back their fleets, idling expensive equipment bought only a few years ago. Small warehousing firms lose contracts when cargoes never arrive for storage. Aviation companies that once carried onward freight in mixed passenger cargo flights report fewer loads, forcing them to cut routes or hike prices. The maritime crisis bleeds into multimodal systems, shrinking revenue for second- and third-tier players across the supply chain. The economic life of entire corridors, stretching inland from seaports into landlocked regions, slows under these conditions. National leaders face pressure not only from fiscal gaps, but also from frustrated citizens. In Egypt, reduced Suez Canal receipts create new challenges for a government already balancing inflation and high debt. In East African states such as Djibouti, unmet public expectations around job creation and growth tie directly into political legitimacy. The promises of turning into regional trade hubs fade when container throughput drops month after month. Leaders face public discontent without quick answers, as maritime insecurity in distant waters cascades into lost household income. Foreign military and strategic interests connected to the region also feel the secondary effects. Djibouti, for example, hosts bases for multiple navies, all justified in part by proximity to vital shipping routes. As the volume of traffic declines, the rationale weakens, at least marginally. While bases are unlikely to close quickly, questions about the return on such investments emerge. Fewer ships calling on nearby ports reduce the commercial activity essential to sustaining those outposts, blending strategic uncertainty with economic fragility. Regional trade ambitions also lose traction. Integration projects that depended on steady access to international markets face rising costs when ships bypass the Red Sea. Exports like agricultural products from East Africa lose competitiveness as freight charges climb and delivery times lengthen. A coffee producer in Ethiopia or a garment factory in Kenya counts on timely access to Europe or Asia. When voyages divert thousands of miles south, buyers hesitate or offer lower prices. What appears as a logistics decision for carriers becomes a squeeze on margins for laborers and producers with little connection to maritime law, but full exposure to its consequences. The pattern by 2025 is clear. While global shipping firms calculate rerouting as an expensive but temporary adaptation, regional economies along the Red Sea pay in deeper and more immediate terms. The Suez Canal, once a dependable pillar of Egypt's economy, registers billions in lost revenues. Saudi ports such as Jeddah and King Abdullah Sea container counts collapse, while East African terminals scramble to retain relevance as Cape ports absorb more business. Each segment of this adjustment follows a predictable chain. Lost tolls limit public budgets, stalled projects drain momentum, port slowdowns cut jobs, and local livelihoods diminish. The statistics only reinforce what is visible on the ground. Suez transits plummeting by more than half in the span of a year, or throughput at King Abdullah down over 80%, are not just abstract figures. They are numbers that translate to cancelled construction, shuttered shops, and families without paychecks. These are the human consequences of a crisis triggered by rerouting ships around a single stretch of contested water. This is why the crisis cannot be read as a technical matter of shipping efficiency alone. It carves into the budgets of states, the stability of port economies, and the prospects of entire regions struggling to climb out of economic fragility. Regional casualties of rerouting highlight how global trade disruptions expose local vulnerabilities, leaving governments grasping for solutions that extend beyond economics. They touch on broader questions of power, influence, and conflict issues that shape not just where vessels sail, but why they are threatened in the first place. It is in this space that the crisis takes on its full dimension, moving from commerce into the realm of political leverage and strategic rivalry. Geopolitics at the edge of the sea. By 2025, geopolitics shapes every conversation about the Bab-el-Mandeb. This strait has become more than a shipping lane or a danger zone for vessels. It is now a stage where local factions, regional rivals, and global powers pursue leverage. The Houthis, embedded in Yemen's fractured political landscape, benefit from geography that far outweighs their conventional military capacity. Holding ground near a narrow maritime choke point allows them to turn influence at sea into bargaining power on land. Each strike they launch against international shipping is not simply an act of sabotage, but a reminder that maritime trade cannot be isolated from the conflicts that rage along the coastlines it passes. Iran's role in this equation is central. The Houthis have received training, financial assistance, and weaponry that, according to multiple reports, includes shipments of advanced drone and missile components traced back to Iranian supply lines. The relationship elevates a faction in Yemen into an effective instrument of regional pressure. For Tehran, support to the Houthis extends influence into the Red Sea, projecting a presence far outside the Persian Gulf, in waters vital to Europe, Asia, and Africa alike. The Houthis' maritime campaign illustrates how backing from Iran has enabled them to escalate from small boat raids into operations that reach hundreds of miles offshore. This connection ensures that attacks in the Bab-el-Mandeb reverberate immediately inside the broader rivalry between Iran and its Gulf adversaries. For Saudi Arabia, the situation carries particular urgency. Riyadh shifted in recent years toward dialogue with the Houthis after a decade of bloody confrontation, but Red Sea insecurity prevents any clean separation between Yemen's internal politics and the kingdom's own security. Saudi oil exports rely on the Red Sea corridor. Disruptions therefore touch core state interests. Any Houthi strike risks undermining the fragile moves toward de-escalation. Even when overtures continue in back channels, the Bab-el-Mandeb acts as a constant reminder for Riyadh that maritime vulnerability can blunt progress ashore. Control over these waters becomes inseparable from questions of Yemen's political settlement and Saudi regional posture. International powers are deeply entangled in the response. Since late 2023 and throughout 2024, US and UK forces have conducted multiple airstrikes on Houthi missile and drone sites inside Yemen, aimed at degrading the group's launch capacity. Alongside this, multinational naval coalitions like Operation Prosperity Guardian, led by the United States, and the European Union's Operation Aspides patrol key shipping lanes to intercept drones and missiles aimed at merchant vessels. These task forces have successfully shot down many incoming threats, yet the strikes have not halted attempts, underscoring the gap between containing damage and changing conditions ashore. This split between military action and diplomatic caution defines the global approach. Within the UN Security Council, debates laid bare the divides. In January 2024, a resolution condemning Houthi attacks passed with broad support, but differing national positions highlighted the difficulty of forging a collective strategy. Some governments push for intensified operations to neutralize threats. Others warn that escalation risks widening conflict across the region. National rules of engagement vary inside the coalitions as well, limiting what coordinated patrols can achieve. For the Houthis, this fragmentation provides maneuvering space. They can mount operations while international actors argue over process and proportionality. Europe's priorities differ from those of Asia. European states, highly dependent on imports via the Suez, but wary of opening another front in Middle Eastern conflicts, emphasize maintaining shipping lanes without heavy escalation. Asian economies, particularly in East Asia, are acutely exposed to energy and manufactured goods flowing through the corridor. Governments in Tokyo, Beijing, and Seoul monitor events closely but hesitate to take prominent roles in a conflict tied so tightly to Western and Gulf rivalries. For the United States, the calculus is heavier still. Its Navy absorbs most of the operational burden, sending advanced warships to intercept drones and missiles, but questions at home point to sustainability. How long can such commitments continue without clear resolution? What emerges is not one coherent international strategy, but overlapping interests struggling to align. Governments want secure trade, but clash on the balance between military deterrence and diplomacy. At the same time, the visible inability to prevent all attacks erodes projected credibility. Countries must explain to their citizens and their allies why armed escorts can limit damage without eliminating risk, why energy prices fluctuate despite constant patrols, and why insurance companies calculate routes as unsafe even under coalition cover. This creates political costs almost as real as the economic ones, feeding debates in parliaments and shaping electoral considerations. For the Houthis, survival and relevance are the rewards of sustaining this tension. Their maritime strategy gives them a platform far larger than Yemen's boundaries, placing them in negotiation frameworks where other militant movements would remain isolated. By broadening the set of targets, striking not only vessels tied to Western powers, but also those flying Asian and African flags, they push the crisis into the agendas of more governments. This diffusion prevents one bloc from bearing sole responsibility and forces wider attention. The Houthis use these maritime attacks in tandem with domestic political aims, asserting their bargaining position against rivals in Yemen and drawing acknowledgement from major regional actors who might otherwise sideline them. Iran benefits indirectly from this expanded scope. The ability of its ally to unsettle global shipping links Baghdad to Beijing, Rotterdam to Riyadh. Even if Tehran maintains deniability, Its regional network gains credibility. An adversary far from Iranian soil can impose costs on the global economy. This extends Iran's influence without requiring direct confrontation, allowing Tehran to shape negotiations across other arenas while pointing to the Bab-el-Mandeb as evidence of its wider reach. The international impasse endures because no actor sees advantage in a decisive shift. Full-scale confrontation against Houthi positions risks widening the war inside Yemen and igniting broader conflict with Iran. Exclusive reliance on diplomacy risks normalization of attacks as leverage, encouraging repetition. Naval escorts, though capable, deliver only partial security, leaving commercial companies to continue calculating risk in dollars and days. The Bab-el-Mandeb thus remains in a gray zone, too vital to abandon, too volatile to stabilize fully. This state of unresolved tension carries forward the central reality. The Strait is not just a passage for trade, but a bargaining tool embedded in regional politics and global rivalry. As long as the Houthis can use maritime attacks to amplify their political weight, and as long as international actors remain divided in strategy, the waterway continues to serve as a pressure point in wider conflicts. That dual role, as both trade artery and geopolitical lever, ensures it will remain a source of instability into the foreseeable future. The pattern is unlikely to shift quickly. Diplomatic overtures will continue, naval patrols will rotate, and airstrikes may flare again, but the underlying conditions, regional rivalries, external sponsorship, and the Strait's strategic significance persist. The result is a fragile equilibrium in which global commerce flows, albeit disrupted, while the risks remain embedded in every voyage. This context sets the stage for how the crisis is now understood beyond the strategic community. For shipping firms, insurers, retailers, and governments, the meaning of Bab-el-Mandeb insecurity lies in the adjustments it forces on all who depend upon it. The complexity of regional rivalries, tactical innovations, and international disagreements converges here, determining not only naval patrol schedules, but also the price of everyday goods worldwide. The Bab-el-Mandeb today is more than a maritime choke point. It is a test of how global commerce adapts when geography, conflict, and economics collide. Each ship that transits carries both cargo and the burden of exposure to forces beyond its control. In short, Bab-el-Mandeb is a narrow strip of water whose disruption now raises supply chain, humanitarian, and geopolitical consequences across continents. Watch the next section for 3 signals that the corridor is getting safer or riskier. If this topic matters to you, tell us in the comments which consequence concerns you most.